Because unlike other prophets who declared God's message to the people, this prophet dialogued with God about people. Most Old Testament prophets proclaimed divine judgment. Habakkuk, on the other hand, pleaded for divine judgment. The book records an interchange between the prophet and his God. Now, we know very little about him, but he seems that he may have been a contemporary of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and Zephaniah. Habakkuk prophesied during the closing days of the once powerful Assyrian Empire and at the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian Empire. The Assyrians were conquered by Babylon in 612 BC. During the reign of Josiah, Judah's last good king, he instituted many reforms in the nation. However, when he died in battle at the hands of the Egyptians, see 2 Chronicles 35, verses 20 through 24, the people reverted back to their sinful and wicked ways. Violence and wickedness became commonplace, and justice had disappeared from the land. In the midst of all of this evil, Habakkuk cried out to God for divine intervention. God answered his prophet, and he told him that he was going to judge his people, the Jews, by using the Babylonians to overthrow them. Habakkuk was stunned. The Babylonians were more evil, wicked, and idolatrous than the Jews. Habakkuk's question to God was basically, how could God use the Chaldeans to judge a people more righteous than they? But God answered that the Babylonians would also be judged for their sins. Now, like Job, who could not understand or grasp the circumstances surrounding him, Habakkuk also argued with his Maker. And through that experience, he came to appreciate and understand God's character even more than he did before. And he ended up having a firmer faith in him. Also, the pivotal verse in this book is found in chapter 2, verse 4, which says, "The just shall live by his faith." That verse is quoted 3 times in the New Testament. In Romans chapter 1, verse 17, Galatians chapter 3, verse 11, and Hebrews chapter 10, verse 38. The references in Romans and Galatians accentuate the heart of the gospel, justification by faith alone. And the reference in Hebrews speaks about a believer's need to remain strong and faithful in the midst of affliction and trials. Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 5 is also quoted by the Apostle Paul in Acts chapter 13, verse 40 and 41, at the end of his sermon in the synagogue at Antioch in Pisidia. Finally, please compare Habakkuk 3, verses 17 and 18 with Philippians chapter 4, verse 4 and verses 10 through 19. Both the prophet and the apostle could rejoice in their God, no matter what the outward circumstances of life might be. So, with that, here's the outline. In chapter 1, Habakkuk is perplexed that God does not punish the iniquities of Judah. That's verses 1 through 4. God's intention of discipline, verse 5. God's instrument of discipline, verses 6 through 11. Then, Habakkuk's dilemma. He questions God's choice of Babylon to judge Judah, verses 12 through 17. In chapter 2, we see God's second response. The just people of Judah will survive, but the unjust Chaldeans will be destroyed. In verse 1, Habakkuk awaits God's answer. In verses 2 through 4, God's admonition to Habakkuk, write. In verses 5 through 20, a catalog of the Chaldeans' sins. Finally, in chapter 3, we see Habakkuk's prayer. In verses 1 and 2, his prayer for mercy. Verses 3 through 15, praise of God's power. And in verses 16 through 19, Habakkuk's peace in ministry. It has been said that the poetry of chapter 3 has been rightly praised on every hand as the most magnificent Hebrew poetry. And because of the concluding note in the book at the end of chapter 3, verse 19, many suggest that the prophet may have been associated with the temple choir, though this is only a conjecture. So, Judah was shortly carried away captive by the Babylonians, but later on, the Babylonians were conquered by the Medo-Persians, and the Jews were allowed to go back home. God will judge sin and rebellion, but the just shall live by faith. Next, the book of Zephaniah.